Nobody showed up to my wedding. Not my mother, not my father, not my golden child brother. Days later, while I was unpacking from my honeymoon, my mother texted me, demanding $3,850 for my brother's new truck. I sent her exactly $1 through Zelle with the message congrats. Then I changed the locks on my own house. 4 hours later, the Atlanta Police Department was flashing their lights in my driveway. My name is Nyla. I am 30 years old. And what my family did not realize as they stood on my porch trying to have me arrested was that they had just handed me the match to burn their entire house of cards to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who tried to use you. The flashing red and blue lights of the Atlanta Police Department cruisers cast harsh shadows across the manicured lawn of my suburban home. The heavy Georgia humidity hung in the air thick and suffocating, much like the presence of the people standing on my front steps. I stood perfectly still in my foyer watching the high-definition feed from my security cameras on my iPad. Outside, the chaos was already reaching a fever pitch. My sister-in-law, Chelsea, was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her blonde hair was deliberately disheveled, and she was clutching her slightly rounded stomach while sobbing hysterically into the shoulder of a very uncomfortable-looking police officer. Through the audio feed, I could hear her frantic, breathless voice echoing in the quiet neighborhood. She was claiming that I was a dangerous, unhinged woman who had illegally locked her out of her own residence, deliberately withholding her vital pregnancy medication and personal property. Standing right behind her, validating every fake tear, was my mother, Vivian. Vivian was dressed in her Sunday best, a tailored church suit she wore like armor, trying to project the image of the respectable, long-suffering matriarch. Next to her was my father, Calvin. His arms crossed over his chest, scowling at my mahogany front door, as if he could intimidate the wood into opening. And there, hiding behind his parents and his weeping wife, was my older brother Malcolm, the 34-year-old golden child who had never faced a consequence in his entire life. The police officer knocked heavily on my door, the sound echoing through my quiet, pristine house. DeAndre, my husband of exactly 1 week, placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. We had just returned from our honeymoon 24 hours ago, only to find my family had turned our home into their personal vacation crash pad. DeAndre gave me a knowing look. I nodded, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. The moment the door swung wide, the sheer volume of the noise hit me. Chelsea let out a theatrical gasp and shrank back against Malcolm as if my mere presence was a physical threat. The two police officers stood on the welcome mat, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, clearly expecting to deal with an aggressive, hostile homeowner based on whatever lies my family had just fed them. Before the officers could even introduce themselves, my mother lunged forward, her voice slicing through the humid night air. "You are a cold-blooded, evil girl, Nyla," Vivian screamed, pointing a manicured finger inches from my face. "I raised you better than this, sending your brother a single dollar when he is in desperate need. And then you have the audacity to lock your own flesh and blood out of the house. You want your brother and his pregnant wife to sleep on the street." "Ma, and please step back," the older police officer instructed, holding up a hand to stop Vivian from advancing any further onto my porch. He turned his attention to me, his expression stern and authoritative. "Miss, we received a call from this family stating that you have unlawfully changed the locks on a shared residence and are currently holding their personal belongings hostage, including vital prescription medication. They claim you are attempting an illegal eviction without notice." I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms. I simply stood my ground, maintaining absolute composure. That infuriated my family even more. They expected the angry, emotional reaction they had always provoked from me in the past. They relied on me losing my temper so they could play the victims. "Shared residence," I repeated, my tone perfectly flat. "Yes, shared, my father," Calvin boomed, stepping up to stand beside my mother. He puffed out his chest, trying to use the same physical intimidation tactics that worked when I was a teenager. "This is a family property. We have had keys to this house for 2 years. Your mother comes here every week to tend the garden. You cannot just change the security codes and lock us out because you are throwing a childish tantrum over a simple request for financial help." Malcolm needs $3,850 to secure his work truck for the family business. Family helps family, Nyla. You do not lock them out like common criminals. Chelsea took this as her cue to escalate. She let out a loud, shuddering sob, clutching her stomach even tighter. "Officer, please," she whined, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "My prenatal vitamins are inside. My special organic supplements. She is doing this on purpose because she hates me. She has always been so aggressive toward me. I am terrified she is going to destroy our things. We just want to get our belongings and go." The younger officer, clearly moved by Chelsea's display, took a step toward my threshold. He said, his hand resting on his radio. "If they have established residency here, you cannot just lock them out. We are going to need you to step aside so they can retrieve their property. If you refuse, we will have to take further action." My mother crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk appearing on her face. She thought she had won. She thought the presence of law enforcement would intimidate me into submission, that I would bow my head, open the door, and write the check for Malcolm just to make the public embarrassment stop. That was how our dynamic had always worked. She used public shame and authority to force me into compliance. But she fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with now. I was no longer the desperate daughter seeking her approval. I was a 30-year-old director of cybersecurity who dealt with high-level corporate threats for a living. I did not crack under pressure. I documented it. I looked directly at the older officer, my expression completely unreadable. "Officers," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sound of Chelsea's manufactured sobs. "I changed the locks to my own house. I did not invite these people here. They do not live here. They have never lived here. They do not receive mail here, they are not on the mortgage, and they do not pay a single utility bill." "Lies," Malcolm shouted from the back of the group. "Do not listen to her. We have been staying here all week." I turned my gaze to my brother, staring at him until he nervously shifted his weight and looked away. "Yes," I continued, addressing the police again. "They have been staying here all week while I was away, without my permission. You see, officers, last Saturday was my wedding day." The officers blinked slightly, taken aback by the shift in the narrative. "I got married exactly 6 days ago," I explained, keeping my tone deadly calm. "These 4 people, my mother, my father, my brother, and my sister-in-law, RSVP'd to my wedding. But when I walked down the aisle, the 5 seats reserved for my immediate family were completely empty. They ghosted my wedding. And do you know where they were?" My mother's smug expression faltered. "Nyla, this is not the time to air family grievances," she hissed. I ignored her entirely, keeping my eyes locked on the police. "They ghosted my wedding because they decided to take a last-minute trip to Cancun to celebrate Chelsea's pregnancy. But apparently they came back early. And because my mother had an emergency spare key strictly for watering my plants while I was on my honeymoon, they decided to let themselves into my home. They used my house as a free vacation crash pad. They drank my wine, smoked on my patio, and trashed my guest rooms. So yes, when I returned home today and discovered what they had done, I immediately revoked all access codes and changed the physical locks. I do not run a free storage facility for trespassers." Chelsea stopped crying abruptly. The younger officer looked back at her, his sympathy rapidly evaporating as the reality of the situation became clear. "This is absurd," Calvin roared, his face turning an angry shade of red. We are your parents, it is not trespassing." At that exact moment, DeAndre stepped out from the shadows of the foyer and stood beside me. At 32, DeAndre was imposing, but it was his sharp, tailored suit and his absolute aura of professional authority that immediately commanded the space. He did not raise his voice, but the weight of his words carried the undeniable force of the law. "Gentlemen," DeAndre said smoothly, reaching into his breast pocket. He pulled out a crisp business card and handed it to the older officer. "I am DeAndre Washington, corporate attorney, and the homeowner's husband." Along with my card, he handed over a folded document with a state seal stamped clearly on the front. "This is the deed to the property. As you can see, Nyla Washington is the sole legal owner of this residence. These individuals have absolutely no legal right to be on this property. They are currently trespassing." The older officer reviewed the deed under the beam of his flashlight, then looked at the business card. His posture immediately shifted from investigative to authoritative, but this time the authority was directed at my family. My mother tried one last desperate play. "You cannot do this. We have belongings in there. Chelsea needs her medication." DeAndre reached down and picked up two black garbage bags that had been sitting just inside the door out of view. He tossed them onto the porch right at Malcolm's feet. The bags landed with a heavy thud. "We packed up the items they left scattered across our guest rooms," DeAndre stated coldly. "Chelsea's prenatal vitamins are in the front pocket of the blue duffel bag inside that trash bag. We are not holding anything hostage. We simply want these trespassers off our property immediately." The older officer handed the deed back to DeAndre with a respectful nod. "Thank you, counselor." He turned to my family, his hand resting firmly on his belt. "All right, folks, you heard the homeowners. You have your belongings. You have zero established residency here. You need to vacate the premises immediately or you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Chelsea's jaw dropped. Malcolm scrambled to pick up the garbage bags, his face flushed with profound embarrassment as several neighbors stepped out onto their porches to watch the spectacle. Calvin glared at DeAndre, his fists clenched, but he knew better than to argue with the police when the legal boundaries had been so clearly established. Vivian stood frozen, staring at me as if looking at a stranger. She had come here expecting me to cave to public pressure, expecting the police to force my hand, expecting to walk away with a check for $3,850 and her pride intact. Instead, she was being escorted off my property like a common criminal in front of the entire neighborhood. I looked at her one last time before I stepped back into my foyer. "Actions have consequences, Vivian," I said softly, knowing the words would cut deeper than any screaming match ever could. "Do not ever show your face at my house again." DeAndre closed the heavy mahogany door, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, echoing with absolute finality. Outside, the red and blue lights continued to flash as the police ensured my family got into their cars and drove away into the humid Atlanta night. This was only the beginning of the storm, but as I stood in my quiet, secure hallway, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally ready to burn the bridge they had spent my entire life breaking. Just 72 hours before those police sirens lit up my driveway, I was standing at the altar, bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a gorgeous botanical garden venue in downtown Atlanta. The string quartet was playing a soft melody, and the scent of white roses filled the room. DeAndre stood across from me, looking incredibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his warm, strong hands holding mine tightly. Everything about the moment was supposed to be picture perfect, exactly the way we had planned it for over a year. But my eyes kept drifting past his shoulder to the very front row on the left side of the aisle, right where the Brideus family is supposed to sit. There were 5 chairs positioned perfectly for the closest relatives. They were completely empty. I stared at the elegant gold foil name cards resting on the velvet cushions. Vivian, Calvin, Malcolm, and Chelsea. The 5th chair was meant for a +1, or simply extra space for Chelsea US designer purse. They had RSVP. Yes, months ago. They had even complained about the menu choices and demanded I change the seating chart 3 times, leading up to the big day. Yet as the officiant began to speak, the glaring absence of my flesh and blood echoed louder than the music in that silent space. I did not cry. I did not feel my heart break into a million pieces. The tears they always expected from me had dried up years ago, along with my patience. Instead, a profound cold realization settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. They were not stuck in traffic. They had not experienced a sudden medical emergency. They had deliberately ghosted my wedding, because just 2 days prior, my mother had accidentally posted a picture on her social media showing the 4 of them boarding a flight to Cancun. The caption read, "Celebrating Chelsea US pregnancy with a much-needed family getaway." They had chosen a spontaneous beach trip to cater to my sister-in-law, US fragile pregnancy cravings, over watching their only daughter walk down the aisle. They could not even be bothered to send a text message to say they would not make it. They simply vanished, leaving their empty chairs as a silent, mocking statement of where I ranked on their list of priorities. I squeezed DeAndre's hands, bringing my focus back to the man who was choosing me as his family, the wedding planner. A highly organized woman who had been hovering nervously near the side entrance caught my eye. She looked completely panicked, her clipboard clutched to her chest, clearly terrified that the bride was about to have a public meltdown over her missing parents. I caught her gaze, gave her a sharp, subtle nod, and tilted my head toward the front row. She hesitated for a second before reading my expression perfectly. She quietly stepped forward, gathered the 5 gold foil name cards in one swift motion, and dropped them straight into the small waste bin hidden behind a floral arrangement. The moment those cards hit the trash, the last remaining tether, holding me to my toxic family, severed completely, I felt lighter. Immediately the tension melted from my shoulders, and I looked at DeAndre with a genuine radiant smile. We exchanged our vows, we sealed our promises, and we walked back down the aisle to the cheers of a crowd that actually wanted to be there. The rest of the evening was spectacular. DeAndre's family embraced me with the kind of unconditional warmth I had never experienced in my own home. His mother held me on the dance floor and told me how proud she was to call me her daughter. My colleagues from the cybersecurity firm toasted to our success. My true friends filled the room with laughter and genuine joy. There was no drama, no passive-aggressive comments about my hair or my career. No one demanding the center of attention. I danced until my feet ached and I went back to our bridal suite, feeling completely at peace with the family I had chosen. We spent the next few days enjoying a quiet mini-moon at a luxury resort just a few hours outside the city. The plan was to relax, disconnect from the world, and simply exist in our newlywed bubble. We turned our phones to do not disturb mode and ignored the outside world entirely. By the morning of our 3rd day, we felt so refreshed and eager to start our new life together that we decided to head back to Atlanta. A day early, we wanted to unpack, organize our gifts, and enjoy one quiet evening in our own home before returning to the demands of our corporate careers. The drive back was filled with easy conversation and the comfortable silence that comes with being truly secure in a relationship. We pulled into our driveway the midday, Georgia sun beating down on the pavement. The house looked quiet from the outside, perfectly normal. But the moment I punched my code into the smart lock and pushed open the heavy front door, the illusion shattered instantly. A wave of stale air hit my face first, carrying the undeniable stench of cigarette smoke and cheap takeout food. I froze on the welcome mat, my hand still gripping the door handle. DeAndre stopped right behind me, his protective instincts immediately flaring as he gently pushed me behind him and stepped into the foyer. We walked into the living room, and the sight before us was absolutely staggering. My pristine, carefully curated home had been turned into a frat house crash pad. The custom cream-colored sofa, DeAndre and I had waited 6 months to have delivered, was covered in greasy food wrappers and crushed chips. 3 empty bottles of my most expensive red wine, the bottles I had specifically bought to age for our future anniversaries, were left discarded on the glass coffee table, leaving dark purple rings on the surface. The television was still on, displaying a paused streaming service menu. Someone had dragged muddy shoes across the vintage rug in the dining room. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, feeling my blood run cold. The sink was piled high with dirty dishes, encrusted with dried food. The marble countertops were sticky and covered in crumbs. I stepped over to the sliding glass doors that led to our backyard patio and saw a mountain of cigarette butts extinguished in my imported ceramic plant pots. Someone had clearly been chain smoking outside and tossing the ashes wherever they pleased. DeAndre walked through the guest rooms, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle ticking in his cheek. They slept in the guest beds, he called out, his voice low and dangerously calm. They left wet towels on the hardwood floors and ripped the packaging off the new toiletries we bought for visiting friends. It did not take a genius to figure out how this happened. My mother had a physical emergency spare key to the back door. I had given it to her a year ago with explicit instructions that it was only to be used to water my indoor plants if I was ever out of town on an extended business trip. She had sworn she would keep it safe and only use it in a genuine emergency. Instead, the moment they realized DeAndre and I would be away for our wedding and mini-moon, they had skipped the ceremony, flown back early from their Cancun trip, and decided to use my empty house as their own personal high-end resort. They had let themselves in, helped themselves to our pantry, raided our wine collection, and treated our home with absolute disdain. Knowing I was not scheduled to return until the following afternoon, they probably planned to slip out tomorrow morning, leaving the mess behind, or doing a terrible job of cleaning it up, forcing me to deal with the aftermath while I was still unpacking my bridal bags. It was a level of disrespect so profound that it transcended mere rudeness. It was a calculated invasion of my safe space. But the true depth of the violation did not hit me until I walked down the hallway to my home office. The door, which I always kept shut, was wide open. I stepped inside and my stomach dropped. My workspace, the place where I handled highly sensitive corporate security data and managed my personal life, was completely trashed. Someone had been sitting at my desk, leaving condensation rings from cold drinks on my wooden desk pad. The drawers of my filing cabinet had been pulled open and left ajar. Papers were shuffled around as if someone had been casually browsing through my personal documents looking for anything interesting to read. My eyes darted immediately to the corner of the room, where I kept a small digital safe bolted to the inside of the closet. It was the safe where I kept my passport, important legal documents, and a few pieces of irreplaceable family jewelry. The closet door was open. I walked over, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The safe had clear scratch marks around the digital keypad and the emergency keyhole. Someone had taken a flathead screwdriver and tried to pry the faceplate off. When that failed, they had clearly resorted to repeatedly entering random codes, trying to force their way in until the system automatically locked down. They had not just come here to sleep and drink my wine. They had come here to snoop, to rummage through my life, and to steal from me. I stood in the center of my violated office, the smell of stale smoke lingering in my clothes, and felt the last remaining drop of daughterly obligation evaporate from my soul. They had pushed me aside my entire life. They had abandoned me on my wedding day, and now they had returned to pick the bones of my home while they thought I was away. DeAndre walked into the office and saw the scratches on the safe. His eyes darkened and he pulled his phone from his pocket, pulling up the contact for the local police precinct. "Do you want me to make the call?" he asked quietly, waiting for my lead. I looked at the damaged safe, then at the empty wine bottles visible down the hall. I thought about the 5 empty chairs at the botanical garden. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, analytical part of my brain take complete control, the part that managed network breaches and dismantled corporate threats. "Not yet," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "First, I am going to check the hidden security logs. Then I am going to lock them out of everything, and then we are going to wait for them to make their next mistake, because I know exactly what they are going to do next." I knelt down on the hardwood floor of my home office and stared at the digital safe bolted securely to the inside wall of my closet. The metallic surface was cold against my fingertips as I traced the deep, jagged scratches scoring the metal around the keypad. Malcolm had always been reckless, but this level of desperation was new. The digital interface was completely locked down, a security feature I had programmed myself after 5 failed passcode attempts, but the backup physical keyhole had been pried open with brutal force. I did not say a word to DeAndre, who was standing quietly in the doorway watching me. I simply reached under the false bottom of my desk drawer, retrieved the master override key, and slid it into the damaged lock. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open, revealing the velvet-lined interior. I took a slow, deliberate breath as I inventoried the contents. My passport was still there. My birth certificate and property deeds were untouched, but the large black velvet box that usually sat right in the center was gone. My chest tightened, not with panic but with a profound, icy rage. That box contained the only thing in this house that truly mattered to me. A heavy 24-karat gold rope chain necklace that my grandmother had worn every single day of her life. Before she passed away, she had explicitly left that necklace to me in her will, bypassing my mother entirely. Vivian had never forgiven either of us for that slight. She firmly believed that as the matriarch, every valuable family heirloom belonged to her by divine right. Malcolm stealing. It was not just a crime of opportunity. It was Vivian taking back what she believed was rightfully hers. I stood up, leaving the safe door hanging open, and walked over to my desk. I booted up my personal laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard, bypassing the standard user interface, and dropping straight into the administrative terminal of my home network. As a director of cybersecurity, I did not rely on basic commercial alarm systems. My house was wired with enterprise-grade firewalls and hidden subroutines that logged every single ping, every device, and every movement within these walls. I pulled up the access logs for the past 72 hours. The data populated the screen in neat glowing rows. I could see exactly when my mother used her emergency code to unlock the back door on Thursday evening. I could see the network recognizing the devices belonging to Malcolm and Chelsea, connecting to my guest Wi-Fi. Less than 5 minutes later, they had not even waited for my wedding rehearsal dinner to finish before invading my sanctuary. I opened the encrypted folder containing the footage from the hidden microcameras I had installed in the office ceiling. The high-definition video feed loaded instantly. There on my screen was my brother Malcolm standing in my closet sweating in a designer shirt as he jammed a flathead screwdriver into my safe. Chelsea was sitting right there in my desk chair, painting her fingernails and laughing while drinking a glass of my vintage wine. And there was my mother Vivian standing in the doorway, keeping watch and giving Malcolm instructions, telling him to hurry up before the neighbors noticed the lights on. Watching my own blood relatives systematically rob me should have broken my heart, but the tears they always expected from me were completely gone. All that remained was a cold, analytical focus. DeAndre and I spent the next 3 hours purging the house of their presence. We scrubbed the marble countertops until they shined. We gathered every empty bottle, every cigarette butt, and every piece of trash they had left behind, and threw them into heavy-duty garbage bags. We found the prenatal vitamins and expensive maternity clothes Chelsea had scattered across our guest room floor. We did not fold them. We simply shoved them into a blue duffel bag and tossed it into the trash bag along with the rest of their discarded items. I wanted absolutely no trace of them left in my home once the physical space was pristine again. I sat back down at my laptop and initiated a complete network purge. I deleted the access codes my mother used from the smart locks. I wiped their devices from my router history. I changed the master passwords and encrypted the entire system, locking down every digital entry point. My home was now a fortress, and they were officially locked out. We sat on the freshly cleaned sofa, waiting in the quiet house. We knew it was only a matter of time before they realized their free vacation home was no longer accessible. Sure enough, at 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. It was a text message from my mother. I stared at the screen, feeling a dark sense of anticipation. I opened the message, expecting a barrage of angry questions about why her door code was not working, but Vivian was far too arrogant for that. She did not mention my wedding. She did not congratulate me on my marriage. She did not even ask how my honeymoon was. Her message was a masterclass in narcissistic entitlement and manipulation. Nyla. The message read, "Your brother is in a bind. Malcolm needs $3,850 for the final payment on his Ford work truck. The bank is threatening to repossess it today, and he cannot lose his business. Family helps family send the money through Zelle immediately, so we can get this sorted out. I will come by your house later to check on the plants." I stared at the screen, zeroing in on the exact dollar amount she had typed, $3,850. It was such a specific, highly unusual number. Most people begging for a bailout would ask for $4,000 or a round number to cover their supposed expenses. But I knew exactly why she was asking for that precise amount. Just last month, I had taken my grandmother's gold chain to an independent jeweler to have it officially appraised, so I could add it to my new homeowner insurance policy. The official appraisal document had been sitting folded up right beneath the necklace in the very safe they had pried open. The appraised value of the gold chain was exactly $3,850. The realization clicked into place with perfect clarity. Malcolm had not just stolen the necklace, he had found the appraisal paperwork. They knew exactly what the jewelry was worth down to the dollar, and now my mother had the absolute audacity to demand the exact cash value of the item they had just stolen from me, pretending it was for a work truck that Malcolm barely even used. They expected me to call them crying. They expected me to rage and scream and demand my necklace back. They wanted the dramatic confrontation because drama meant they could play the victim. They would tell the whole family that I was being selfish, that I cared more about a piece of jewelry than my own brother losing his livelihood. They would twist the narrative until I was the villain, and they were the poor, struggling victims. But I refused to play my assigned role in their toxic family dynamic anymore. I did not call her. I did not type out an angry paragraph demanding my property back. I simply opened my banking app on my phone and navigated to the transfer menu. I typed in the phone number for my mother, linking directly to her Zelle account. The app prompted me for the transfer amount. I slowly and deliberately typed in the number, one followed by a decimal point and 2 zeros. Exactly $1 the screen then prompted me for a memo to attach to the transfer. I kept my face completely expressionless as I typed out my message using the exact tone she always hated. Buy some common sense. Congrats on the truck I hit. Send. The app flashed a green checkmark confirming the transfer was successful. $1 had been deposited into the bank account of my mother. DeAndre watched me from across the living room, his arms crossed over his chest, a mixture of pride and cautious anticipation in his eyes. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I just sent my mother $1, I replied, setting my phone face down on the table. "And now we wait." It did not take long. The silence in the house was broken exactly 30 minutes later when the notification from my Ring doorbell chimed loudly through the hallway. Motion detected at the front door. I picked up my iPad and pulled up the live camera feed. They had arrived. Vivian, Calvin, Malcolm, and Chelsea were all standing on my front porch. They were ready to wage war over the perceived disrespect of a $1 transfer. They were ready to demand entry to a house they no longer had access to. They were ready to call the police to force my hand and punish me for daring to establish a boundary. They thought they were walking into a typical family argument where the loudest voice wins. They had no idea they were walking into a legal and financial slaughterhouse that would systematically strip them of everything they held dear. The morning after the police escorted my family off my property, my phone vibrated on the nightstand with a message that I knew was coming. My mother had failed to use the law against me, so she immediately pivoted to the only other authority she respected: the church. The text was not from her, though it was from my Aunt Shirley, the oldest and most vocal member of our extended family, demanding that DeAndre and I appear at the Greater Grace Fellowship Hall at noon sharp for a family mediation in our community. The church is not just a place of worship, it is the ultimate court of public opinion, and my mother had clearly spent the entire night spinning a narrative of her own victimhood to the pastor and the elders. She wanted a home court advantage where she could use social pressure and religious guilt to force me into compliance. I did not argue. I simply replied that we would be there. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored beige pantsuit that projected absolute professional authority. DeAndre wore a charcoal suit, looking every bit the ruthless corporate attorney that he was. We drove to the church in comfortable silence, the southern heat already baking the asphalt. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot of the brick building where I had spent every Sunday of my childhood, I knew exactly what we were walking into. My mother had set a trap, hoping to corner me with an audience, but she forgot that I build traps for a living. We walked through the heavy wooden doors, and the smell of floor wax and old paper hit me instantly. The fellowship hall was dimly lit, and in the center of the room sat a long folding table. The staging area for my mother was theatrical production pastor. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his hands folded over a worn Bible, looking deeply disappointed. My Aunt Shirley and Uncle Ray sat to his right, their faces stern and judgmental. On the opposite side sat my family. My mother Vivian was clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes red and puffy, from what I am sure was hours of manufactured crying. My father, Calvin, sat stiffly beside her, his jaw set in a hard line of patriarchal anger. Malcolm slumped in his chair looking like a beaten dog, simply trying to survive the harsh world. And right next to him was Chelsea. Chelsea was putting on a masterclass in manipulation. She was wearing a faded, oversized maternity shirt that made her look small and fragile. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she was staring down at her lap, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She looked exactly like a helpless victim who had barely survived a traumatic ordeal. The moment DeAndre and I walked in, the energy in the room shifted. The elders looked at us with heavy disapproval, scanning our expensive clothes and calm demeanor, as if our success was a direct insult to the struggling family across the table. We took our seats opposite them, and the silence stretched out heavy and accusatory. Pastor Thomas cleared his throat and opened the mediation, looking at me with sad, weary eyes. Nyla, he began, his voice carrying that practiced pastoral cadence. Your parents came to me last night, broken-hearted. They told me about the terrible misunderstanding at your home. They are deeply wounded that you would lock them out in the dark and call the authorities on your own flesh and blood, especially when your brother is just trying to get his life together to provide for his growing family. The Bible teaches us to honor our parents and to uplift our siblings. But your mother tells me that money has hardened your heart, that you have forgotten where you came from. I sat perfectly still, my face completely blank, letting him speak. My mother dabbed at her eyes with the tissue, casting a pitiful glance around the room. It breaks my heart, Pastor Vivian sobbed, her voice trembling perfectly. We just asked her for a small bit of help. Malcolm is trying so hard to keep his trucking business afloat. He just needed $3,850 to keep his work truck from being repossessed. We thought since Nyla has been so blessed with her big corporate job and her fancy house, she would want to help her brother succeed. Instead, she sent me $1 with a nasty message and threw us out on the street like garbage. I do not even know who this person is anymore. She has let the love of money poison her soul. Aunt Shirley shook her head, clicking her tongue in disgust. You were raised better than this, Nyla. Your parents broke their backs to give you a good life, and now that you have a little bit of money, you think you are better than the people who raised you. Family is all you have in this world. You cannot buy your way into heaven, and you certainly cannot treat your brother like a beggar when he is about to bring a new child into this family. I did not interrupt them. I let them build their narrative, observing how easily my mother had manipulated the elders into seeing me as the greedy, arrogant villain who had lost her way. The elders were projecting their own insecurities onto me, viewing my boundaries as an attack on the traditional family hierarchy, where parents are absolute rulers and children exist to serve the collective unit. Calvin leaned across the table, pointing a thick finger at me. You embarrassed us in front of the whole neighborhood, he growled, sending the police to humiliate your mother over a simple request. You owe your family an apology, and you owe your brother that money. It is the least you can do after everything we have sacrificed for you. But the most insidious part of the ambush was yet to come. Chelsea, who had been sitting quietly playing the role of the terrified bystander, suddenly let out a soft, pathetic sniffle. All eyes turned to her. She looked up at the pastor, her eyes swimming with fresh tears, and her lip quivering. Pastor, she began, her voice small and shaky. I do not want to cause any trouble. I really do not. I love this family so much, and I just want us all to get along. But I have to be honest, I am genuinely terrified of Nyla. The room went dead silent. Chelsea wiped a tear from her cheek, perfectly executing the weaponized fragility that she had perfected over the years. She knew exactly what she was doing, using coded language to paint me, a successful black woman, as a dangerous physical threat. She looked around the table, making sure everyone was hanging on her every word. She has always been so hostile toward me, Chelsea continued, her voice catching. I try to be nice, I try to include her, but she is just so angry all the time. Yesterday when she opened that door, she looked at me with so much aggression, I honestly thought she was going to attack me and my baby. She was so unhinged, Pastor. I was having a panic attack. The way she stands there, the way she looks at people. It is just so hostile and scary. I do not understand why she is so aggressive when we just wanted to get my prenatal vitamins. She practically threw our things at us like we were animals. I watched the elders internalize her words. It was a sickening display of microaggressions playing out in real time. Chelsea was using the oldest trick in the book, leveraging her white tears to cast me as the angry black woman, the aggressive, irrational threat who needed to be contained. And the tragic part was that the elders, my own people, were nodding along, sympathetic to her performance, because my mother had already primed them to view me as the enemy. Chelsea was not just playing the victim, she was actively assassinating my character using racial stereotypes to ensure the church elders viewed my calm boundary setting as an act of senseless violence. "I have been having nightmares," Chelsea whispered, burying her face in Malcolm Yosh's shoulder. Malcolm patted her back, glaring at me as if I had physically struck his pregnant wife. "I just want my baby to be born into a loving family. But Nyla makes me feel so unsafe. I do not even want to be in the same room as her. She is just so intimidating and mean, and I do not know what I ever did to deserve it." Aunt Shirley slammed her hand on the table, clearly enraged by my supposed behavior to a fragile pregnant woman. "Look at what you are doing to this poor girl." "Nyla," she scolded, looking at me with pure disgust. "You are a grown married woman acting like a schoolyard bully. You sit there with a blank look on your face, not even showing a drop of remorse. You need to get down on your knees and ask God to remove this bitterness from your heart. You need to apologize to Chelsea right now, and you need to write that check for your brother to make this right." Pastor Thomas sighed deeply, looking at DeAndre and me as if we were lost souls. "DeAndre, Nyla," he said softly, his voice thick with pastoral disappointment. "The path of pride leads only to destruction. Your family is offering you a chance to make amends. They are willing to forgive your hostility if you just humble yourself. Write the check for Malcolm, return the spare key to your mother, and ask for forgiveness. We can pray over this right now and heal this family before the devil tears it apart completely." They sat there looking at me, waiting for me to break, waiting for the guilt to wash over me, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and buy my way back into their good graces. They thought the pressure of the church, the tears of my sister-in-law, and the judgment of the elders would finally crush my resolve. They thought they had successfully backed me into a corner where my only option was total submission to their demands. DeAndre shifted slightly in his chair, preparing to speak, but I placed a gentle hand on his knee, stopping him. This was not a legal battle yet. This was a psychological war, and I was about to deploy a payload that would permanently destroy the network of lies my mother had spent her entire life building. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I remained as calm and cold as a machine processing code. "Pastor Thomas," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the quiet fellowship hall, "I appreciate you taking the time to mediate this situation. I really do. But the narrative you have been given is fundamentally flawed. My mother claims she was thrown out on the street over a simple request for help. My father claims I embarrassed them without cause, and Chelsea claims she is terrified of my supposed aggression because I hostilely withheld her medication." I slowly reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my iPad, placing it flat on the wooden table between us. "The truth, Pastor," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my mother, whose smug expression was beginning to falter, "is that my family did not come to my house to retrieve medication. They did not come to water plants, and Malcolm does not need $3,850 for a work truck. The truth is much darker and much more pathetic than that." I unlocked the iPad and opened the application that connected to my secure home network server. My family thought they were so clever using my house as a playground while they thought I was away on my honeymoon. They thought they had left no trace of their true intentions, but they forgot that they were dealing with someone who designed surveillance architecture for multi-billion-dollar financial institutions. They forgot that I see everything. Chelsea let out a small, confused gasp, looking down at the iPad. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere. I did not say another word to defend myself. I did not argue against Chelsea, U.S. racist microaggressions, or Aunt Shirley, U.S. religious guilt trips. I simply turned the screen of the iPad to face the pastor and the elders, turned the volume all the way up, and pressed play on the hidden camera footage I had pulled from my home office the time before. Talking was over. It was time for the data to speak for itself. The small screen of my iPad was entirely inadequate for the magnitude of the truth I was about to display, and I knew that my mother would simply claim the video was doctored if she could only see it from across the table. I picked up the device, my movements deliberate and unhurried, letting the heavy silence in the room stretch out. The Fellowship Hall of Greater Grace was equipped with a state-of-the-art audiovisual system that they used to broadcast sermons and display announcements on two massive flat-screen televisions mounted high on the brick walls behind the pastor. I turned away from the folding table and walked directly toward the media console, tucked into the corner of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished linoleum floor. Pastor Thomas watched me with furrowed brows, asking in a hesitant voice what I was doing, but I did not answer. My mother stood up from her folding chair, her voice rising as she demanded that I sit back down and show some respect to the church elders. DeAndre simply shifted his stance, blocking her path and calmly instructing her to remain seated while I finished my presentation. The church network was protected by a basic commercial password that offered zero resistance to someone with my professional background. It took my fingers less than 15 seconds to override their standard display protocols, bypass the local firewall, and sync my device directly to the main monitors. The large screens flickered for a fraction of a second, transitioning from a static image of a cross to the direct feed from my secure home servers. The silence in the fellowship hall grew heavy and thick as everyone turned their heads upward to look at the massive glowing screens. The fluorescent lights of the church reflected off the glossy monitors, making the vivid colors of the footage pop with absolute clarity. The resolution was flawless, crisp 4K quality, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation, blurred lines, or denial. My mother sank slowly back into her chair, her face draining of color as she recognized the background of the video. It was my private home office, the sanctuary. They thought they had successfully violated, without consequence, and the place they assumed held no secrets. The footage began with a clear timestamp in the lower right corner, showing the exact date and hour when I had been standing at the botanical garden, exchanging my wedding vows. The audio clicked on, echoing through the church speakers with devastating precision. The first thing everyone heard was not the sound of a desperate brother struggling to survive, but the loud, obnoxious laughter of my sister-in-law, Chelsea. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the room. Chelsea was not crying. She was not having a panic attack, and she certainly did not look intimidated by anyone or anything. She was lounging comfortably in my expensive ergonomic desk chair, her feet kicked up on my mahogany desk with her dirty shoes still on. She was holding one of my crystal wine glasses filled to the brim with my vintage reserve red wine, and she was laughing uncontrollably. She looked entirely relaxed, entirely entitled, and completely devoid of the fragile victimhood she had just performed so masterfully for the pastor minutes earlier. The church elders stared at the screen, their mouths slightly open as they watched the woman who had just claimed to be terrified of my aggressive nature sip my stolen wine with a smug expression on her face. Chelsea was mocking the wedding decor she had seen in the invitation, complaining about how ridiculous it was that I was spending thousands of dollars on a ceremony while they could barely afford their luxury car payments. She took another sip of wine and giggled, telling Malcolm to hurry up before he broke a nail. The camera panned slightly, catching movement in the corner of my closet. There was my brother Malcolm, the supposed hardworking family man who just needed a little help to keep his business afloat. He was sweating profusely, his designer shirt clinging to his back as he aggressively jammed a heavy flathead screwdriver into the digital keypad of my personal safe. He was grunting with effort, cursing under his breath as he gouged the metal surface over and over again, trying to pry the heavy steel door open by brute force. He responded to Chelsea with a bitter laugh, muttering that I owed them this money because I had always been too selfish with my corporate salary, and that family was supposed to share their wealth. He gritted his teeth and shoved the screwdriver deeper into the locking mechanism, twisting it violently until a loud metallic snap echoed through the office speakers. The safe door finally gave way, swinging open to reveal the velvet-lined shelves inside. Malcolm reached inside his hands, shaking with adrenaline, and bypassed the stack of legal documents and passports. He went straight for the large black velvet box resting in the center. He pulled it out and flipped the lid open. The bright overhead lights in my office caught the gleam of my grandmother West's heavy 24-karat gold rope chain necklace. Malcolm pulled the necklace from the box, holding it up like a trophy, making the gold catch the light. Chelsea actually cheered from the desk, clapping her hands together and telling him that the pawn shop downtown would easily give them a few thousand for it. Malcolm shoved the family heirloom deep into his pocket, looking visibly relieved. He told Chelsea that they finally had enough to cover their tracks, and that no one would ever notice it was gone until it was entirely too late. The video laid bare the undeniable truth that the specific amount of $3,850 was never about a truck payment. It was the exact street value of the necklace he had just stolen. Just as Malcolm turned away from the ruined safe, the audio picked up another voice echoing from the hallway outside the office. It was the unmistakable voice of my mother, Vivian. She was calling out to them, warning them to hurry up because the neighbors might notice the lights on inside the house. She told them to grab what they needed and get out before they triggered any secondary alarms. Her voice was not that of a worried mother trying to stop her children from making a terrible mistake. It was the voice of a lookout actively participating in the burglary of her own daughter's U.S. home, ensuring they got away with the theft undetected. The video ended abruptly, cutting back to a black screen with my cybersecurity agency logo pulsing quietly in the center. The fellowship hall was plunged into a silence so absolute it felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. I slowly uncoupled my iPad from the media console and walked back to the center table, my footsteps echoing sharply against the linoleum floor. Pastor Thomas looked physically ill, his hands trembling where they rested on his open Bible. He stared at the blank screens, unable to process the sheer level of deception he had just witnessed. Aunt Shirley had covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with complete and utter shock as she looked from the television screens to my mother and then to Malcolm. All the righteous indignation, all the religious guilt, all the judgmental lectures they had prepared for me, completely evaporated into the humid air. The narrative of the struggling innocent brother and the terrified pregnant wife had been instantly and surgically destroyed right in front of their eyes. They had seen the truth in high definition, and there was no amount of tears or prayers that could erase the reality of what my family had done. I took my seat quietly beside DeAndre, placing the iPad face down on the table. Chelsea was shrinking into her chair, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. Her white tears and claims of intimidation meant absolutely nothing, now that the elders had seen her true nature lounging in my chair and plotting to pawn my stolen property. Malcolm was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone. U.S. gaze, the golden child had been exposed as a common thief stealing from his own sister to fund his reckless lifestyle. My father, Calvin, sat rigidly, his jaw tight, but he had nothing to say. He could not defend a video that clearly showed his son committing a felony. My mother, Vivian, looked as though the ground had opened up beneath her. The respectable church-going matriarch image she had cultivated for decades was shattered beyond repair. The elders who had looked at me with such heavy disapproval just moments ago were now glaring at my family with unmasked disgust. The mediation they had called to force me into submission had become the exact instrument of their own total humiliation. The suffocating silence in the fellowship hall lasted for exactly 10 seconds before the survival instincts of my sister-in-law kicked into high gear. Chelsea realized instantly that the crisp, high-definition footage had completely obliterated her narrative of the fragile, terrified pregnant woman lounging in my desk chair and drinking my vintage wine while her husband committed a felony was not exactly the picture of helpless victimhood, so she did the only thing she knew how to do when backed into a corner. She panicked and immediately threw the closest person to her straight under the bus. Chelsea let out a sudden, sharp gasp that echoed through the quiet church room. She pushed her folding chair violently away from Malcolm, the metal legs scraping harshly against the linoleum floor, as if his mere proximity was suddenly toxic to her. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, her shoulders heaving with exaggerated force. Pastor Thomas looked startled, his pastoral instincts kicking in as he watched the young woman break down completely in front of his congregation. "I did not want to be there," she wailed, peering through her fingers to make sure the pastor and the elders were watching her performance. "I was so scared." "Pastor Thomas, you have to believe me. Malcolm told me we were just going over to check on the house. I had no idea he was planning to break into a safe when he pulled out that screwdriver. I was terrified. He has such a terrible temper when it comes to money. and I was so afraid that if I tried to stop him, he might hurt me or the baby. She looked at my brother, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. Malcolm stared back at her, his jaw dropping in absolute disbelief. The golden child who had always been protected by his parents was now watching his own wife sacrifice him to save her own skin. Chelsea turned her attention rapidly back to the head of the table, fixing her tear-filled eyes on my parents. She clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate prayer, pleading for their mercy. "Mr. Calvin, Miss Vivian, you know how much I love this family," Chelsea cried, her voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable. "You have been so incredibly good to me, taking me in, treating me like your own daughter, feeding me Sunday dinners and helping us prepare for this baby. I would never disrespect you or your legacy. I was just trying to keep Malcolm calm in that office." I drank the wine and laughed because I was trying to diffuse the situation. I was playing along because I was a hostage to his reckless behavior. Was just a scared pregnant woman trying to survive the night. I watched the church elders physically react to her display. Aunt Shirley, who had been glaring at Malcolm with disgust just moments prior, suddenly softened her expression as she looked at Chelsea. The weaponization of her white tears was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It was a masterclass in manipulation, flipping the script to portray herself as a tragic victim of a violent, unpredictable black man, even if that man was the son of the very people she was pleading with. My mother, Vivian, always susceptible to maintaining the image of a benevolent matriarch, actually reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on Chelsea's arm. "Oh, you poor thing," Vivian murmured, casting a furious glare at her son. "Malcolm, what is wrong with you, dragging your pregnant wife into your criminal mess and forcing her to watch you steal? You have disgraced this family." Malcolm tried to defend himself, stammering that it was Chelsea's idea to check the safe in the first place, but no one was listening to him. The room had already accepted the narrative that Chelsea was the innocent bystander trapped in a bad situation. I sat back in my chair watching the performance reach its peak. DeAndre looked at me, his expression completely impassive, but I could see the subtle tightening of his jaw. He knew exactly what was coming next. I waited until Chelsea had squeezed the absolute maximum amount of sympathy from the room. I waited until Pastor Thomas began to nod softly, preparing to offer her some pastoral grace for being trapped in a toxic marriage. I let her build her innocent facade back up, brick by careful brick, because destroying it the second time would require something much more permanent than a video. "Pastor Thomas," I said, my voice cutting through Chelsea. West dramatic sobs like a scalpel. "It is truly remarkable how adaptable memory can be when faced with accountability." Chelsea paints a very compelling picture of a terrified woman acting under duress. But unfortunately for her, the digital footprint she left behind paints an entirely different portrait. Chelsea stopped crying instantly, her head snapping up to look at me. Her eyes were wide, but the fear in them was suddenly very real, very authentic. My mother snatched her hand back from Chelsea's arm, looking between the two of us in confusion. Pastor Thomas frowned, looking at the blank television screens on the wall and asking me what I meant by a digital footprint. When my family decided to use my home as a vacation crash pad, I explained, my tone completely conversational and devoid of anger. They made several critical errors. They assumed that because I was away on my honeymoon, my digital security infrastructure was inactive. But as a director of cybersecurity, I design systems that never sleep. When Chelsea logged into my guest Wi-Fi network, using the password she found written on my kitchen whiteboard, she bypassed her cellular data provider and routed all of her unencrypted traffic directly through my personal servers. Chelsea's face drained of all color, passing through pale and landing directly on a sickly shade of gray. She gripped the edge of the folding table, her knuckles turning white. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She tried to stand up, murmuring that she felt sick and needed to leave the room, but DeAndre shifted his chair slightly, making it clear that the exit was blocked. "When you connect to a network designed for high-level threat analysis," I continued, tapping the screen of my iPad, "those servers log every single data packet, every website visited, every image downloaded, and every unencrypted text message transmitted over the local area network. I did not have to hack your phone. Chelsea, you willingly handed me your entire conversation history the moment you connected to my router to save your cellular data. I tapped the screen one final time, and the massive televisions on the brick wall flickered back to life. The frozen image of my home office vanished, replaced instantly by a bright green screen displaying a group text chat. The chat was titled The Mimosa Mamas, and the participants were clearly Chelsea and three of her closest girlfriends. The text on the screen was massive, impossible for anyone in the fellowship hall to ignore or misinterpret. The church fell into a silence so profound, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit working overhead. The elders squinted at the screens, reading the exact words that Chelsea had typed while sitting in my desk chair drinking my wine. The timestamps matched the security footage, perfectly confirming that she was sending these messages at the exact moment Malcolm was breaking into the safe. OMG, you guys! Chelsea had typed her message, followed by 3 crying, laughing emojis. Malcolm is literally prying open Nyla us safe right now. This is hilarious, one of her friends replied, asking if they were going to get caught. Chelsea US response appeared on the screen a few seconds later, casting a harsh green glow over my mother us face. No way, Chelsea had written. Vivian is standing by the door, acting like a paranoid security guard. These people are so dramatic and stupid. Calvin and Vivian are honestly so gullible. They believe anything I say. I literally just cried about the baby, and Vivian gave me her credit card for maternity clothes yesterday. They are just ghetto cash cows, and I am milking it until the money runs out. A collective gasp echoed through the church. Aunt Shirley dropped her purse on the floor, the sound loud and startling in the quiet room. Pastor Thomas removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if he could not believe what he was reading. Reading, my father. Calvin turned slowly to look at Chelsea, his chest heaving with a sudden violent anger. The golden daughter-in-law, the sweet innocent white woman who had just praised their legacy, had been mocking their race and their intelligence to her friends, calling them gullible ghetto cash cows behind their backs. But the most devastating message was yet to come. I scrolled down on my iPad, pushing the next block of text to the main monitors. Another friend in the chat had asked what they were hoping to find in the safe. Chelsea US response was typed out in clear, undeniable English. Nyla has this hideous vintage gold chain from her dead grandma. Chelsea had written, I saw the appraisal paperwork on the desk earlier. It is worth almost $4,000. I finally convinced Malcolm to stop being a coward and fence it downtown tomorrow morning. If we pawn the necklace, we can finally book that luxury venue in Buckhead for my baby shower. Vivian is too broke to pay for it anyway, so Nyla can accidentally fund it for us. The impact of those words hit the table like a physical shockwave. My mother, Vivian, looked as if she had been violently struck in the chest. She pressed both hands over her heart, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The respectable church-going matriarch had just learned that her favorite daughter-in-law viewed her as a stupid, easily manipulated piggy bank, and that the entire burglary had been orchestrated not out of desperation for a work truck, but to fund a lavish party at a luxury venue. Malcolm stared at his wife, his eyes wide with betrayal. He had taken the risk, he had committed the felony, and he had faced the wrath of the church elders, thinking he was providing for his family. But the text proved that Chelsea had manipulated him into committing grand larceny simply to impress her friends at a baby shower. The golden child suddenly realized he was nothing more than a pawn in his wife. Was social climbing schemes. Chelsea was no longer crying. The manufactured tears had dried up instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The mask of the fragile victim had been ripped off so violently that she could not even attempt to put it back on. She stammered, reaching out a trembling hand toward my mother, trying to say that the messages were taken out of context, that it was just a joke between friends, but no one was listening to her anymore. Aunt Shirley leaned across the table, her voice shaking with a righteous fury that needed no microphone. You sit in the house of the Lord and play the victim after calling this family ghetto. Cash cows. You manipulate this boy into stealing his grandmother, U.S. jewelry for a party. You are a wicked, deceitful woman, and the truth is finally out in the light. I uncoupled my iPad from the church system for the second time, letting the screens fade to black, The destruction of Chelsea U.S. innocent facade was absolute and irreversible. She had tried to use race and fragility to turn my community against me. But the unencrypted network data had exposed her as a manipulative racist opportunist who viewed my entire family as disposable assets. The mediation was over, and the power dynamic in the room had permanently shifted, but I was not finished yet because the missing necklace was only a small piece of a much larger financial puzzle, and it was time to show my parents what golden child had really been doing with their money. The heavy silence that followed the blacking out of the television screens was broken, not by an apology or an admission of guilt, but by the violent scraping of metal against linoleum. My father, Calvin, pushed his folding chair back and stood up, his massive frame towering over the mediation table. The sheer humiliation of watching his daughter-in-law expose her racism and his son exposed as a common thief in front of the very church elders he had spent decades trying to impress was too much for his fragile ego to process. Instead of holding the people sitting next to him accountable, the patriarch of our family did exactly what he had done for my entire life. He redirected all of his shame, all of his anger, and all of his toxic pride directly at me. Calvin slammed both of his heavy hands down onto the folding table, making the wood shudder and the plastic water cups tremble. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and the veins in his thick neck were bulging. He looked at me not as a daughter who had just been deeply violated and robbed, but as an insubordinate employee who had dared to question his absolute authority. "How dare you?" he bellowed, his deep baritone voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the fellowship hall, bouncing off the brick walls with an aggressive, terrifying force. "How dare you bring this kind of disrespect into the house of the Lord and humiliate your family over some material things?" I sat perfectly still, watching the man who was supposed to be my protector twist reality to fit his patriarchal narrative. He did not care that Malcolm had broken into my safe. He did not care that Chelsea had called him and my mother gullible ghetto cash cows. All he cared about was that I had stripped away the illusion of his perfect family unit in front of Pastor Thomas and Aunt Shirley. "You think you are so smart?" Calvin shouted, pointing a thick, calloused finger right at my face. "You think, because you have a fancy corporate job and a big house that you can sit there and judge your own blood. Your brother made a mistake. He was desperate to provide for his pregnant wife. And you want to sit here and play judge and jury over a piece of jewelry, a necklace, Nyla. You are trying to destroy this entire family over a piece of metal." Aunt Shirley gasped, placing a hand over her chest. "Calvin," she whispered sharply, attempting to intervene, "you just watched your son commit a felony, and your daughter-in-law mock our people. You cannot possibly be defending this behavior." But my father ignored her entirely. His tunnel vision locked entirely on destroying my composure. He was a man who had built his identity on being the provider, the boss, the ultimate decision-maker in our family tree. And I had just proved that he had absolutely zero control over his own house. He puffed out his chest, standing taller, attempting to use physical intimidation to force me into submission. "You listen to me, and you listen to me? Good." Calvin spat, his eyes narrowing with a dark, vindictive energy. "I built this family from the ground up. I started my trucking company with one used rig, and I broke my back for 30 years, hauling freight up and down the East Coast, so you could have food on your table and clothes on your back. I built a legacy, a real business, a family empire that commands respect in this city. And I did it all so that I could pass something down to my children, so that the Washington name would mean something in Atlanta." He took a deep breath, letting his rage fuel his next words. Words he believed would completely devastate me. Words he thought would finally break my calm facade and bring me to my knees begging for his approval. "And since you want to act like you are completely independent, since you want to treat your own brother like a criminal and drag our dirty laundry into the church for everyone to see, then you can be completely independent. Starting right now, you are officially cut off, Nyla. I am writing you out of the will today. You will not see a single dime of my money. You will not see a single truck. You will not see a single share of the business. You are completely disinherited." He looked around the room, making sure Pastor Thomas and the elders were listening, trying to reclaim his power by flexing his financial leverage. "The trucking company, The pride of this family is going 100% to Malcolm, he declared, placing a heavy hand on my brother's shoulder. Malcolm looked up, his eyes widening with sudden hope, realizing that despite committing grand larceny, his father was still going to reward him with the ultimate prize. Malcolm is the heir to the business, Calvin continued, staring me down with cold, calculating eyes. He is the one who understands family loyalty. He is the one who is going to take over the fleet and keep the family name alive. You get nothing, Nyla. You are entirely dead to me, and you will never touch a single piece of the company I built. My father stood there breathing heavily, waiting for my reaction. He expected tears. He expected panic. He expected me to apologize, to beg him not to take away my share of the family empire. He expected the threat of financial ruin to force me back into the obedient, subservient role I was supposed to play. But I did not flinch. I did not blink. I did not even bother to respond to his grand declaration, because I did not need to, before I could even open my mouth. The dynamic in the room shifted once again, this time driven by the quiet, lethal precision of my husband, DeAndre, who had been standing silently in the back of the room, observing the entire chaotic mediation like a hawk, watching its prey finally moved. He stepped forward into the harsh fluorescent light of the fellowship hall, his tailored charcoal suit moving fluidly as he approached the folding table. DeAndre was not just an imposing figure. He was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the city of Atlanta. He specialized in mergers, acquisitions, and hostile corporate takeovers, and he approached my father not as a son-in-law dealing with family drama, but as an apex predator stepping into a courtroom. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He did not match Calvin's aggressive energy. His demeanor was chillingly calm, radiating an absolute unbreakable legal authority. He carried a slim black leather briefcase in his left hand. He set it down on the table right in front of Calvin. The sharp metallic click of the brass locks snapping open echoed loudly in the quiet room, cutting through the lingering tension of my father. This ridiculous speech. DeAndre slowly and methodically pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents bound together with heavy black clips and stamped with the official red and gold seals of the state of Georgia. He slid the heavy stack of papers across the smooth surface of the folding table until it bumped gently against my father. Wes folded hands. Calvin looked down at the documents, his brow furrowing in confusion. He glanced back up at DeAndre, opening his mouth to demand what this was. But DeAndre spoke first, his voice low, smooth, and utterly devastating. "That was a very passionate speech," Calvin DeAndre said, keeping his eyes locked entirely on my father. "You spoke beautifully about building a legacy and passing down a business to your son. It is a shame that almost every single word of it was a complete and utter fiction." My mother, Vivian, gasped, clutching her pearls as she stared at my husband. "How dare you speak to him that way?" she cried out, attempting to regain some control over the collapsing situation. "You are talking to the owner of Washington Logistics. You show him some respect." But DeAndre did not even look at her. He kept his focus entirely on my father, pinning him down with a gaze so intense that Calvin actually took a half step back. DeAndre reached out and tapped a long, elegant finger against the top page of the legal documents right over the state seal. "You cannot disinherit Nyla from a company you do not own." Calvin DeAndre stated his words, dropping into the fellowship hall like heavy concrete blocks. Calvin's face contorted in a mix of fury and bewildered panic. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its thunderous boom. "I built that company. It is my name on the trucks. It is my sweat in the asphalt. I own every single part of that business." DeAndre shook his head slowly, a ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You did build it, Calvin. You built it and then you drove it straight into the ground. You ran it with absolute incompetence. You let Malcolm drain the operating accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle. You failed to pay your corporate taxes. You defaulted on your commercial fleet loans, and you let the business rot from the inside out. You do not own a trucking empire. Calvin, you own an illusion." I watched my father's face drain of blood, passing from angry red to a sickening shade of gray. He looked down at the documents, his hands trembling slightly as he realized that the polished corporate lawyer standing across from him was not bluffing. The church elders leaned forward in their seats, completely captivated by the brutal dismantling of the patriarch. U.S. pride. Malcolm was staring at his father, the realization slowly dawning on him that his promised inheritance might be entirely worthless. Open the file. Calvin DeAndre instructed, gesturing to the paperwork. Flip to the second page. Look at the articles of organization. Look at the operating agreements. Look at the chain of title and the commercial loan payoffs. Do you see your name listed as the managing member? Do you see your name listed as the majority shareholder? Do you see your name listed anywhere with actual executive authority? Calvin slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy folder, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon, the state seals, and the notarized signatures. His breath caught in his throat as he read the fine print, the truth that had been hidden from him for years, suddenly laid bare under the fluorescent lights of the church. DeAndre stood tall, towering over my father, U.S. crumbling ego, wrapping the legal noose tightly around his neck. You lost that company years ago. Calvin DeAndre continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality. And if you turn to the next page, you will see exactly who saved it. You will see exactly who owns the trucks, the routes, the contracts, and the payroll. You will see exactly who holds 100% of the equity in the business you just threatened to take away from my wife. Calvin flipped the page, his eyes widening in sheer absolute horror as he read the name printed clearly on the ownership line. The powerful patriarch who had just spent 10 minutes threatening to leave me with nothing finally realized that he was staring at the sole proprietor of his entire existence, setting the stage for the most devastating financial revelation of his life. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind of silence that only exists when someone's entire worldview is being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Calvin's hands were shaking so violently that the thick parchment paper rattled against the table. He read the line again and again as if staring at the ink would somehow change the letters printed on the page. But the legal reality was immutable. The state of Georgia did not care about his pride or his ego. It only cared about the executed contracts and the registered deeds. My mother. Vivian leaned over, trying to see what had caused her husband to freeze so completely. Calvin, what is it? She whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear. Read it to me. What does it say? But Calvin could not speak. His throat was working soundlessly, his eyes darting frantically between the documents on the table and my face. I sat there looking back at him with the same cool, detached expression I had maintained since we walked into the building. I felt no pity for him, I felt no regret for what DeAndre was exposing, because Calvin had brought this upon himself the moment he tried to use my financial stability as a weapon against me. Malcolm leaned forward, grabbing the edge of the folder and pulling it toward himself to read the documents. He squinted at the legal terminology, struggling to comprehend the dense corporate language, until his eyes finally landed on the ownership disclosure. His jaw dropped open, and he let out a choked breath, looking at his father in complete betrayal. Dad, he stammered, his voice pitching upwards in panic. Dad, what is this? This says the company is an LLC. It says the managing member is Nyla. What does this mean, Dad? Tell me what this means. DeAndre did not give Calvin the chance to formulate a lie or spin another false narrative to protect his son. He stepped in, closing the trap completely. It means exactly what it says. Malcolm DeAndre stated, his tone sharp and unforgiving. Giving it means that for the past 36 months, the company you both thought you were running has been entirely owned and operated by a holding company, registered directly to your sister. You do not work for your father. Your father, Malcolm, you work for Nyla. Your father does not own the trucks. Your father works for Nyla. Every single dollar that has kept you from living on the streets has been authorized and dispersed by the very woman you just tried to disinherit. The shockwave that hit the family was palpable. Chelsea, who had been trying to make herself invisible since her racist text messages were exposed, let out a tiny, horrified gasp, realizing that the ghetto cash cow she had been mocking was actually the sole source of her husband. U.S. income. Aunt Shirley closed her eyes and shook her head, murmuring a quiet prayer under her breath. witnessing the absolute destruction of my father. U.S. Pride Pastor Sir Thomas sat frozen, unable to mediate a conflict that had escalated far beyond family bickering and into the realm of high-level corporate warfare. Calvin finally found his voice, though it was a mere fraction of the booming baritone he had used just minutes prior. "This is illegal," he choked out, pointing a shaking finger at the documents. "This is some kind of corporate theft. You tricked me. You manipulated the paperwork to steal my legacy from under me. I am going to sue you. I am going to take you to court and get my business back. You cannot just secretly buy a man who has life work." DeAndre actually laughed, a short, cold sound that held absolutely zero amusement. "There was no trick, Calvin, there was no theft. There was only your staggering incompetence and your daughter, us incredible generosity. You signed these papers 3 years ago, when the bank was exactly 48 hours away from seizing your commercial fleet and foreclosing on the house you and Vivian live in. You were so desperate to hide your failure from the church and your friends that you blindly signed the restructuring agreements without bothering to read the transfer of equity. You thought an anonymous angel investor had bailed you out. You thought you had simply secured a new line of credit. But Nyla was the angel investor. She bought your bad debt. She paid off your defaulting loans, and she took legal ownership of the assets to save you from total ruin." My father sank back into his folding chair, looking like a deflated balloon. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation was crashing down on him. He had threatened to cut me out of the family business to reward the son who had just robbed my safe. But the reality was that I was the only reason the family business still existed at all. I had protected them. I had saved them from homelessness and public disgrace. And in return, they had abandoned me on my wedding day. Trashed my home, stolen my grandmother, U.S. heirloom, and tried to publicly humiliate me in front of the church congregation. But the corporate documents on the table were not just proof of my ownership, they were the gateway to the final and most devastating truth about why Malcolm had stolen the necklace in the first place. Because owning the company meant I also owned the ledgers, the tax filings, and the audit trails. And it was finally time to reveal the true depth of the criminal behavior that the Golden Child had brought down upon their heads, exposing a financial fraud so severe that no amount of pastoral prayer or parental protection could ever save them from the federal consequences that were already marching directly to their doorstep. DeAndre did not move an inch from where he stood, towering over the folding table. His presence alone commanded the entire fellowship hall, radiating the kind of absolute legal certainty that could dismantle dynasties and ruin legacies with a single signature. He looked down at my father, Calvin, who was still staring at the ownership documents, as if the ink might magically rearrange itself back into his favor. The patriarch of the Washington family, the man who had just spent the last 20 minutes threatening to leave me with absolutely nothing, was now completely paralyzed by the realization that he possessed nothing to leave. DeAndre let the silence stretch, allowing the sheer weight of the revelation to crush whatever remaining pride Calvin was clinging to before he began to surgically expose the true extent of the financial catastrophe my father had created 3 years ago. Calvin DeAndre said, his voice smooth and carrying effortlessly to every corner of the quiet church room. 3 years ago, Washington logistics was bleeding out on the asphalt. You were losing clients faster than you could secure them because your fleet was falling apart. You refused to pay for basic maintenance. You ignored the mechanics, and you let your drivers operate unsafe vehicles because you needed to funnel the operating capital into something else, or rather someone else. DeAndre shifted his gaze directly to my brother Malcolm, who flinched and looked down at his shoes, unable to meet the eyes of the corporate attorney exposing his failures. You let your son treat the corporate accounts like his own personal piggy bank? DeAndre continued dissecting the timeline of their ruin with clinical precision while the trucks were breaking down on Interstate 20. Malcolm was using the company credit cards to fund his lifestyle. He was buying designer clothes, taking lavish vacations, and playing the role of a successful executive, while the actual business was completely starved of resources. You knew he was draining the accounts, Calvin. You saw the numbers, but your pride and your blind devotion to your golden child stopped you from holding him accountable. You chose to protect Malcolm instead of protecting the business you built from the ground up. and that choice brought you to the absolute brink of total annihilation. My mother. Vivian let out a shaky breath, her hands clutching the edge of the table as she listened to DeAndre dismantle the myth of her husband. U.S. business acumen. She had spent decades sitting in the front pews of this very church, bragging to the other women about her successful husband and her brilliant son. She had worn her status like a crown, using their supposed wealth to look down on people who were struggling. And now she was being forced to listen to the undeniable truth that her entire life was funded by a house of cards that had collapsed years ago. By the time the winter rolled around 3 years ago, DeAndre stated, tapping his finger on a specific paragraph in the legal binder, the bank had completely run out of patience. You had defaulted on 4 consecutive commercial loan payments. Your credit lines were frozen, and your vendors were threatening to seize the trucks. You were completely insolvent, Calvin, but you were too ashamed to admit it to your wife or your church community, so you kept quiet while the bank initiated the final stages of asset liquidation. But the trucks were not enough to cover the debt you had accumulated. Was it, Calvin? Calvin, because you had used your personal residence as collateral to secure those loans. Vivian gasped loudly, her head snapping toward my father with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She choked out her voice, barely a whisper. Calvin, tell me he is lying. Tell me you did not put the house up for the business. My father could not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the documents, his massive shoulders slumped forward in complete defeat. The silence was all the confirmation my mother needed, the reality that she had been days away from losing her suburban home, her sanctuary of status and respectability hit her like a physical blow. They sent the final foreclosure notices right before Christmas. DeAndre revealed, twisting a knife deeper into the fabric of their deception. You hid the letters from Vivian. You intercepted the mail, and you lied to her face, telling her business was booming, while you were quietly packing your office, anticipating the moment the bank would send the sheriffs to physically remove you from the property. You were 72 hours away from being thrown out onto the street. Calvin, 72 hours away from losing the trucks, the house, and every ounce of respect you commanded in this city. You had failed, completely and utterly, and there was absolutely no one left to bail you out. Aunt Shirley shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with shock as she processed the magnitude of the lie her brother had been living. Pastor Thomas closed his Bible, pushing it slightly away from him, as if distancing himself from the toxic deception that had been brought into his fellowship hall. The community elders who had been ready to condemn me just half an hour ago were now looking at my father with profound pity and deep disappointment. Disappointment the mighty. Calvin Washington had been exposed as a failure, who had risked his family, us home, to cover up his son, us reckless greed. Malcolm was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he realized that the entire church now knew he was the reason his parents had almost become homeless. Chelsea, who had been trying to make herself as small as possible since her racist text messages were broadcasted, looked at her husband with undisguised contempt. She had married Malcolm believing he was the heir to a lucrative logistics empire. The realization that he was nothing more than a parasite who had bankrupted his own father was clearly shattering her delusions of grandeur. That is when the anonymous holding company stepped in. DeAndre said, his voice shifting from accusatory to factual. An investment group reached out to the bank, purchased your bad debt for pennies on the dollar, and completely absorbed the commercial loans. They paid off the mortgage arrears, securing the house, and they provided a sudden injection of operating capital to keep the fleet moving. You thought it was a miracle, Calvin. You thought some angel investor had seen potential in your failing business and decided to give you a second chance. You eagerly signed the restructuring agreements, transferring 100% of the equity to the holding company, simply to keep your name on the side of the trucks and avoid public disgrace. DeAndre stepped back from the table, gesturing toward me with an open hand, giving me the floor. It was time for me to deliver the final killing blow to the patriarchal ego that had suffocated me my entire life. I did not stand up. I did not need to. My authority was absolute, and it radiated from the quiet stillness of my posture. I looked directly at my father, watching the realization slowly creep into his eyes as he connected the dots between the anonymous holding company and the daughter he had just tried to disinherit. There was no miracle, Dad, I said, my voice calm and perfectly modulated. There was no angel investor who swooped in to save your legacy because they believed in your business acumen. The holding company was a limited liability corporation that I established specifically for the purpose of acquiring your debt. I took the corporate bonuses I had earned from my cybersecurity contracts. The money you always told me was meaningless because it was not a traditional business, and I used it to buy your entire existence. Calvin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, his brain struggling to comprehend that the daughter he had always treated as a secondary citizen, the daughter he had constantly belittled and pushed aside in favor of his golden son, was the only reason he was not currently sleeping in a homeless shelter. Vivian covered her face with her hands, weeping silently, as the absolute humiliation of the situation washed over her. She had spent her life treating me like an inconvenience only to discover that I was the secret architect of her survival. You do not own a single steering wheel in that fleet. Dad, I continued, my words falling like heavy stones in the quiet church. You do not own the tires, you do not own the contracts, and you certainly do not own the right to pass the company down to Malcolm. The business you just threatened to take away from me is entirely my property. I am the sole managing member of the LLC. You and Malcolm are not executives. You are not owners. You are W-2 employees. You are salaried workers who operate at my discretion and solely by my grace. The reality of the power dynamic permanently shifted in that exact moment. The traditional family hierarchy, where Calvin was the king and Vivian was the queen, was completely obliterated. They were not my superiors, they were my dependents, the very people who had ghosted my wedding, who had deemed me unworthy of their presence on the most important day of my life, had been surviving exclusively on the paychecks that I had been quietly signing for the last 36 months. You let Malcolm steal from my safe to cover his tracks, I said, shifting my gaze to my brother, who shrank back into his folding chair, looking completely broken. You allowed him to treat my home like a personal playground. You supported his reckless behavior because you thought you still held the power in this family. You thought you could use the threat of the business to keep me in line. But you cannot threaten me with my own property. Calvin, you cannot fire the owner, and you certainly cannot disinherit the person who actually holds the deed to your entire life. Pastor Thomas let out a long, heavy sigh, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. The mediation had turned into an absolute massacre of the Washington family pride. The elders who had previously nodded along with my mother, whose tearful performance were now completely silent, recognizing the profound poetic justice of the situation. The daughter who had been rejected and cast aside had quietly ascended to the throne, holding the financial lives of her abusers entirely in her hands. I pay for your health insurance, Dad, I stated, driving the reality home with cold, relentless facts. I authorize the payroll that keeps Malcolm's lights on. I maintain the commercial leases that keep the trucks on the road. I have spent the last 3 years quietly managing the back end of the business, ensuring that the taxes are paid and the vendors are satisfied, while you walk around Atlanta, acting like a self-made mogul. I protected you from the consequences of your own incompetence, because despite everything I still believed in family. I paused, letting the word hang in the air, bitter and hollow. But family does not skip a wedding to go to the beach, I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Family does not break into a safe and steal a grandmother. U.S. heirloom family does not sit in a church and use racist microaggressions to paint their own blood as an aggressive threat. You all made your choices last weekend. You decided that treating me with basic human respect was beneath you. You decided that I was just a resource to be used and discarded when it suited your convenience. Calvin finally dropped his head, staring down at his large, calloused hands resting on the table. He looked completely hollowed out. A man who had just watched his entire identity evaporate into thin air. The blustering, aggressive patriarch who had yelled and threatened me just moments ago was gone, replaced by a broken employee realizing he had just declared war on his boss. Vivian was shaking her head back and forth, murmuring, denying the reality, but unable to produce a single coherent argument against the legal documents sitting on the table. Malcolm let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying his face in his hands. He knew exactly what this meant for him. He had spent his entire life riding his father's U.S. coattails, believing he was destined to inherit an empire without having to actually work for it. The realization that he was nothing more than an expendable employee, subject to the authority of the sister he had always looked down upon, was completely destroying his fragile ego. Chelsea pushed her chair even further away from him, looking at her husband with undisguised revulsion, realizing that her ticket to a luxury lifestyle had just been permanently cancelled. But my role as the secret CEO was not just about the trucks or the payroll, I said, leaning forward slightly, making sure every single person in the fellowship hall was hanging on my next words, because owning the company means I also own the administrative access to the corporate accounts. It means I have full visibility into the general ledger, the tax filings, and the audit trails. And it means I know exactly why Malcolm was so desperate for $3,850 that he was willing to pry open my safe with a screwdriver. Malcolm's U.S. head snapped up, his eyes wide with a sudden visceral terror that had nothing to do with losing his inheritance. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The theft of the necklace was just a symptom of a much larger, much more devastating disease, and as the owner of the company, I was legally obligated to audit the books, a process that had uncovered a financial crime so severe that the local police who had visited my porch the night before were the absolute least of my family U.S. worries, because the real authorities were already on their way. The absolute silence in the fellowship hall was entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the suffocating quiet of impending doom. Malcolm was visibly shaking his hands, gripping the edge of the folding table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. I walked slowly back over to my iPad, which was still connected to the church audiovisual system. My movements were deliberate, forcing my family to wait in agony. I tapped the screen and the bright green chat logs vanished, replaced by a stark white background filled with dense financial spreadsheets. The numbers were tiny from a distance, but the red highlighted boxes were impossible to miss. When my mother texted me, demanding exactly $3,850 for Malcolm, she claimed it was a matter of life and death for his business, I said, letting my voice carry across the room. She said Malcolm was going to lose his brand new work truck if he did not make the final payment to the dealership by the end of the week. My father nodded vigorously, trying to defend this one last piece of his son's U.S. dignity. Calvin insisted that Malcolm had been working overtime to expand the fleet, and that this truck was essential for a new logistics contract they had just secured. I looked at Calvin with a mixture of pity and disgust, because he actually believed the lie his son had fed him. I tapped the screen, enlarging a specific section of the spreadsheet. Dad, I own the company, I said, my tone clinical. I see every invoice, every fuel charge, and every vehicle registration. There is no new work truck. The company has not acquired a single piece of new equipment in over 36 months. I pulled the inventory logs last night. Your fleet consists of the exact same 8 decaying rigs you have been running into the ground for a decade. The dealership, you think Malcolm is buying a truck from, does not even have an active vendor profile in our accounting software. Malcolm fabricated the entire story to get his hands on quick cash. Calvin shook his head, refusing to accept it, muttering that he had seen the paperwork himself. But DeAndre stepped forward and quietly stated that Malcolm had printed fake invoices off the internet using a generic template. My mother looked confused, her eyes darting between me and the spreadsheet. But why that specific amount? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why ask for $3,850 if there is no truck? That brings us to the most interesting part of this entire tragedy, I replied. Malcolm did not just pull that number out of thin air. It was not a random guess. That was the exact appraised value of my grandmother's gold chain, the chain he pried out of my safe. He needed that specific amount down to the last dollar because he was trying to plug a very specific, very illegal hole that he had dug for himself. I swiped my finger across the iPad, bringing up a new document on the church monitors. This one was not a spreadsheet. It was an official government form bearing the seal of the Small Business Administration. The elders squinted at the screen, and Pastor Thomas let out a heavy sigh, recognizing the document instantly. It was a federal loan application, a request for pandemic relief and business expansion funds. Malcolm had submitted this application 6 months ago, claiming he needed the money to retain drivers and upgrade the fleet. He requested a massive sum of money from the federal government. And because Calvin had given him unrestricted access to the company tax identification numbers, the loan was approved and the funds were dispersed directly into a secondary account that Malcolm controlled. But Malcolm is not a financial genius, I explained, pointing to the signature line on the massive screens. He is just a greedy amateur. He applied for a federal business loan using the tax ID of a limited liability corporation that he does not own. He forged his name as the managing member of my company. He committed identity theft and federal wire fraud with a single stroke of his pen. And he thought he got away with it because the money cleared the bank. He thought he had successfully stolen tens of thousands of dollars from the government to fund his lifestyle. The screen shifted again, this time displaying the bank statements from that secondary account. There were no transactions for truck maintenance. There were no payroll disbursements to struggling drivers. The entire ledger was a masterclass in reckless personal spending. I highlighted the most recent charges, making them fill the massive screens. There were the plane tickets to Cancun, the luxury resort bookings, the expensive dinners at beachfront restaurants. There were thousands of dollars spent on designer baby clothes for Chelsea. There was the tab for the lavish baby shower they were planning, the very same shower Chelsea had bragged about in her text messages. They had ghosted my wedding to go drink margaritas on a beach using stolen federal funds. Chelsea started weeping again, but this time she was not performing. She was terrified. She was looking at the screen, realizing that her designer bags and luxury vacations were purchased with money that was going to send her husband to federal prison. Malcolm sat frozen, his eyes locked on the floor, completely unable to defend himself against the digital paper trail that proved his guilt. Calvin was clutching his chest, breathing heavily, as he realized his golden child had just turned the family business into a criminal enterprise. But the reckless spending was only the beginning of Malcolm's U.S. problem. I continued pushing the narrative toward its inevitable, devastating conclusion. The federal government is notoriously slow, but they are not stupid, I said, pulling up the final document. It was a formal notice of audit from the Small Business Administration and the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS flagged the secondary account last month. They noticed the discrepancies between the loan application and the actual corporate tax filings submitted by my holding company. They demanded a full reconciliation of the funds. They gave Malcolm a strict deadline to prove that the money was used for legitimate business expenses or to return the unspent balance immediately. If he failed to balance the ledger, they would hand the file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for criminal prosecution. Malcolm panicked, I explained, piecing together the timeline for the horrified church congregation. He managed to scrape together most of the money to pay back the government. He maxed out his personal credit cards. He took out predatory payday loans. He drained whatever small savings he and Chelsea had left. He liquidated every asset he could quietly sell without Calvin noticing. But after completely destroying his own financial future, he was still short. He needed to balance the fraudulent ledger before the federal deadline expired at the end of the week. And the exact amount he was short, the exact amount standing between him and a federal indictment, was exactly $3,850. The entire room let out a collective breath as the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The arbitrary number my mother had demanded in her text message was not for a truck. It was the exact shortfall Malcolm needed to avoid prison. Malcolm knew about the appraisal of my grandmother's U.S. necklace because he had been snooping in my office before the wedding. I stated, my voice cold and unyielding. He knew it was worth exactly the amount he needed to pay back the government. So when they skipped my wedding and broke into my house, he went straight for the safe. He stole family history to cover up a federal crime. He thought he could pawn the necklace, deposit the cash into the business account, balance the ledger, and pretend the entire fraud never happened. My mother, Vivian, stared at her son, her face completely devoid of its usual arrogant pride. Malcolm, she whispered, her voice cracking. You stole from the government. You used the business to steal from the government. Malcolm finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I am sorry," he choked out looking at Calvin. "I thought I could invest it. I thought I could double the money and put it back before anyone noticed. I just wanted to give Chelsea the life she deserved. The baby is coming and we had nothing." I panicked. "Dad, you have to help me." Calvin did not reach out to comfort his son. He did not offer to fix it. For the first time in his life, Calvin turned his back on his golden child, recognizing that this was a mess he could not simply yell his way out of. "You asked me for the money first," Malcolm, I reminded him, cutting off his pathetic apologies. "You told Mom to guilt-trip me into sending the cash so you would not have to pawn the necklace. But when I sent you exactly $1, you realized your easy way out was gone. That is why you called the police to my house. You thought if you created a scene, if you forced your way inside under the guise of retrieving personal property, you could grab the necklace and run to the pawn shop before the government deadline. You weaponized the police against me to cover up your own wire fraud." Chelsea pushed her chair violently away from Malcolm, grabbing her designer purse. Her face was a mask of absolute terror and self-preservation. "I had nothing to do with this," she shrieked, looking wildly at Pastor Thomas and the elders. "I did not know where the money came from. He told me it was a business bonus. I am not going to jail for him. I want a divorce, Malcolm. I am leaving you." She scrambled away from the table, completely abandoning the man she had just claimed was her protector. She was willing to play the victim to steal from me, but she was entirely unwilling to stand by her husband when the federal consequences arrived. I looked at the church elders who were now staring at my family with a mixture of horror and profound pity. The respectable Washington family, the pillars of the community, were nothing more than frauds, thieves, and liars. My mother had brought me to this church to humiliate me, to force me to bow down to her authority, and fund my brother-us criminal lifestyle. But I had simply handed them the shovel and let them dig their own grave in front of everyone they cared about. I uncoupled my iPad from the church system for the final time, letting the screens above the pastor fade back to their static religious imagery. The truth was out, the financial guillotine had fallen, and there was absolutely nothing left for them to say. The heavy, suffocating silence that had draped itself over the fellowship hall was suddenly shattered by the loud, unmistakable sound of the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the church being pulled open. The heavy brass hinges groaned in protest, echoing off the brick walls like a judge striking a gavel. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance, expecting perhaps a late-arriving church member or a custodian. But the people stepping through the threshold were not there for a Sunday service or a pastoral mediation. They moved with a synchronized, purposeful urgency that immediately changed the atmospheric pressure in the room. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, dressed in sharp, immaculate dark suits, their expressions completely devoid of emotion or sympathy. They did not look around the room with curiosity. They looked straight ahead with absolute tactical precision, and clipped to the belts of their tailored trousers, catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the church were the unmistakable gleaming gold and silver badges of federal investigators. The local police who had responded to my front porch the night before were there to handle a domestic dispute. But the agents walking down the center aisle of Greater Grace Fellowship were an entirely different breed of authority. These were special agents from the Office of the Inspector General, representing the Small Business Administration, working in direct coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not care about family drama. They did not care about Aunt Shirley Us, religious guilt trips, or Pastor Thomas U.S. mediation efforts. They cared exclusively about wire fraud, identity theft, and the misappropriation of federal relief funds. My mother. Vivian let out a strangled, gasping sound, shrinking back into her folding chair, as if trying to melt into the floorboards. She had spent her entire life worrying about her social standing in this church, and now federal agents were marching down the aisle to arrest her golden child right in front of the elders she had invited to witness my humiliation. DeAndre stood up from his chair, his posture relaxed, but commanding. He reached into his leather briefcase, one final time, pulling out a single sheet of paper stamped with a federal tracking number. He looked down at my father, Calvin, who was staring at the approaching agents with wide, uncomprehending eyes. DeAndre's voice was low, but it carried the absolute crushing weight of the law. You really thought we were just going to let Malcolm commit federal fraud using my wife us company tax identification number without taking action? DeAndre asked the question, hanging in the air like an executioner U.S. blade. As a corporate attorney, bound by strict ethical guidelines, and as the husband of the sole managing member of the LLC, I had a fiduciary duty to report the fraudulent loan application the moment Nyla uncovered it in the ledger. Hiding a federal crime is a felony, Calvin, and we were never going to risk Nyla's U.S. freedom or her corporate career to protect a thief who just tried to break into our home. Malcolm began to shake violently, his entire body vibrating with the kind of primal terror that completely bypassed rational thought. He looked at the federal agents closing the distance between the doors and the folding table, and he let out a pathetic whining noise that sounded like a wounded animal 24 hours ago. DeAndre continued, ensuring that every single person in the room understood the exact timeline of their destruction 24 hours ago, right after Nyla downloaded the unencrypted security footage and audited the commercial bank accounts. I drove directly to the federal building downtown. I handed the special agents a complete unredacted dossier containing the forged loan application, the bank transfer logs showing the funds being moved to Malcolm U.S. secondary account, the receipts for the Cancun trip, and the video evidence of the attempted burglary to cover up the shortfall. The federal government moves incredibly fast when you hand them a perfectly packaged open and shut case of wire fraud. The lead federal agent, a tall man with iron gray hair and a gaze that could freeze water, stopped exactly 3 feet from the folding table. He did not introduce himself to Pastor Thomas. He did not acknowledge my mother, us weeping. He locked his eyes directly on the sweating, trembling man sitting next to Chelsea. Malcolm Washington. The agent stated, his voice flat and authoritative, lacking any hint of warmth or hesitation. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and the fraudulent procurement of federal business relief funds. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. Calvin, whose entire identity was built on being the protector and the patriarch of his family, experienced a sudden, desperate surge of misguided parental instinct. He pushed his chair back and stood up, attempting to physically block the path between the federal agents and his son. Wait a minute, Calvin shouted, his voice cracking with panic. You cannot just come into a church and take my boy. This is a misunderstanding. He is a good man. He just made a bad business decision. I can pay the money back. Can write a check right now. Just give us some time to clear this up. The female agent stepped forward, her hand resting casually but purposefully near the firearm holstered at her hip. She looked at Calvin with an expression of absolute profound indifference. Sir, she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through his blustering patriarch routine. You need to step back from the suspect immediately. If you interfere with a federal arrest warrant in any capacity, you will be placed in handcuffs and charged with obstruction of justice. Step back now. Calvin froze, the reality of the situation finally shattering the delusion he had lived in for decades. He was not the king of a logistics empire. He was not a powerful man who could intimidate his way out of consequences. He was just a failed businessman, standing in a church watching the federal government rip his family apart because he had enabled his son's U.S. reckless greed for too long. Calvin slowly raised his hands in surrender and took 3 stumbling steps backward, leaving Malcolm completely exposed and utterly alone. Malcolm looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from his mother, who was hiding her face in her hands, to his father, who had just backed down to the church. Elders who were staring at him in silent, horrified judgment. He had no allies left. He had no one to bail him out, but the most brutal and poetic betrayal was yet to come. Chelsea, the woman he had stolen for the woman he had risked federal prison to impress, realized in a fraction of a second that her proximity to Malcolm was about to drag her down with him. She had seen the text messages projected on the screen. She knew everyone in the room recognized her complicity, and she knew the federal agents might consider her an accessory to the wire fraud. Chelsea let out a piercing, theatrical scream that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She jumped up from her chair, but instead of running away, she turned and violently shoved Malcolm squarely in the chest, pushing him directly toward the waiting federal agents. Get away from me, she shrieked, her voice echoing with pure, unadulterated self-preservation. "Do not touch me, you criminal! I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I did not sign any loan documents. I did not know the money was stolen. You lied to me. Malcolm. You told me. You were a successful businessman. I want a divorce. I am filing for divorce today. I will not let you ruin my life and my baby us life. Because you are a greedy, pathetic thief." She pushed him again, harder this time, her manicured hands striking his shoulders as she physically distanced herself from the sinking ship. Malcolm stumbled forward, propelled by the force of his wife, U.S. rejection, and right into the grasp of the federal agents. The lead agent caught Malcolm by the arm, spinning him around with practiced efficiency before Malcolm could even process that his wife had just discarded him like garbage in front of the entire congregation. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The metallic click was loud and sharp, ringing out with the absolute finality of a closing coffin lid. Malcolm broke down completely. He stopped trying to be a man and reverted instantly to the spoiled, sheltered child my parents had created. He sobbed openly, tears and snot streaming down his face as he looked desperately over his shoulder at my mother. "Mom, please," he cried out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "Mom, do not let them take me. Do something. Please tell them I am sorry, Dad. Please help me. I do not want to go to jail. Dad, please." Vivian let out a guttural, heartbreaking wail, reaching a trembling hand out toward her son, but remaining firmly planted in her folding chair. She was too paralyzed by the shame of the public spectacle to actually intervene. Calvin just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes completely vacant, as he watched the inevitable culmination of 34 years of terrible parenting. The church elders looked away, unable to bear the sheer pathetic nature of the golden child. Was collapsed. Pastor Thomas bowed his head, closing his eyes as if praying for a swift end to the nightmare that had invaded his sanctuary. The agents did not pause for the emotional display. They patted Malcolm down, removing his wallet, his phone, and his keys, placing them into an evidence bag. They read him his Miranda rights, in a steady, monotonous drone that cut through his desperate sobbing. The female agent took a firm hold of his bicep, and they began the long, humiliating walk back down the center aisle of the fellowship hall. Malcolm dragged his feet, crying and begging as they escorted him past the empty wooden pews, past the media console where his digital downfall had been projected, and finally out through the heavy wooden double doors, taking him out of the church and into the harsh, glaring reality of the federal justice system. The doors closed behind them, cutting off the sound of Malcolm us weeping, leaving the fellowship hall, drowning in a profound, devastated silence. Chelsea was standing near the wall, trembling and wrapping her arms around her stomach, trying to maintain her victim posture. But no one was looking at her with sympathy anymore. Aunt Shirley was glaring at her with unmasked revulsion, recognizing the sheer venomous disloyalty of a woman who would shove the father of her child toward federal agents just to save her own skin. My parents remained frozen in their places, a portrait of total absolute ruin. The respectable life they had fought so hard to project, the legacy they had tried to protect by throwing me under the bus, had been entirely incinerated. They had lost their son to the federal prison system. They had lost their daughter-in-law to her own ruthless self-interest. They had lost their business, their secret financial lifeline, and their standing in the community, all in the span of 45 brutal minutes. I sat quietly at the table looking at the two people who had given me life, and then spent the rest of it trying to make me feel small. They had chosen their golden child over me every single time. They had enabled his worst impulses, protected him from every consequence, and allowed him to steal from me to cover his tracks. They thought their love could shield him from the real world, but all it did was ensure that when he finally fell, he would take their entire existence down with him. The destruction of the Washington family was complete, and it was a masterpiece of their own making. DeAndre reached over and gently closed his leather briefcase, the brass lock snapping shut with a soft, satisfying click. He stood up, offering me his hand. I placed my hand in his, letting him help me to my feet. We did not say another word to my parents. We did not offer Chelsea any parting insults, or Pastor Thomas. any apologies for the disruption. We had brought the truth into the light. We had executed the legal consequences, and our business in that church was permanently concluded. I picked up my iPad, smoothed the front of my tailored suit, and turned my back on the wreckage, walking out of the fellowship hall with my husband, my dignity and my absolute freedom securely intact. The months that followed the showdown at Greater Grace Fellowship played out with the cold, predictable efficiency of a perfectly executed algorithm. I did not hesitate or second-guess my decisions for a single moment. The very next morning, DeAndre and I sat in a pristine glass-walled conference room at his corporate law firm, and I signed the formal documents to legally liquidate the anonymous holding company that had kept my family afloat. I drafted a single certified letter terminating Calvin from his position as a salaried employee, effective immediately cutting off the commercial leases and permanently freezing the payroll accounts. I did not offer severance, and I did not answer the frantic phone calls that flooded my corporate office line, without the invisible safety net of my money funding their lifestyle. The reality of my parents' financial incompetence hit them with devastating speed. The bank, which had been legally held at bay by my holding company, finally moved forward with the foreclosure on the sprawling suburban house that Vivian had defended so fiercely. They were given exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. They had to hastily pack their remaining belongings, hiring cheap movers to haul their status symbols into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a much less desirable neighborhood, far away from their country club friends. The loss of their house and the very public spectacle of Malcolm being arrested by federal agents completely stripped them of their prestigious standing at the church. They were no longer the proud, successful matriarch and patriarch who judged others from the front pews. They became the local cautionary tale. Whispers followed them down the grocery store aisles and into the fellowship hall, until the heavy, crushing shame became entirely too much to bear and they stopped attending Sunday service, altogether fading into the background of a community they used to rule. Malcolm did not fare any better. The federal government was not interested in his tearful apologies or his pathetic attempts to blame his pregnant wife for his financial mismanagement. The paper trail I had handed over was bulletproof, leaving his public defender with absolutely no leverage. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud and identity theft, simply to avoid a lengthy and embarrassing trial. The federal judge, unswayed by Calvin begging for leniency, handed down a severe sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary, followed by heavily monitored probation. All of the golden child privilege in the world could not save him from a concrete cell. Chelsea, true to her opportunistic nature, filed for divorce. The very same week, Malcolm was indicted, stripping him of whatever meager personal assets he had left to secure a private settlement for herself. She moved back in with her own parents, playing the role of the deceived innocent wife, and severing all ties with the Washington family. The legacy Calvin had sacrificed everything to protect was completely eradicated, reduced to court documents and foreclosure notices. I observed their collective downfall from a distance, feeling absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sorrow, no lingering desire for revenge. Just the profound, quiet relief of a surgical amputation, healing cleanly. 6 months into the prison sentence of my brother, an email bypassed my commercial spam filters and landed directly in my primary inbox. It was from Vivian, writing a desperate, rambling message, begging for forgiveness. The email was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She claimed that the devil had gotten into the family, that they had lost their way, and that they desperately needed my financial help to pay for the mounting medical bills of my father and a new lawyer to appeal the federal sentence of Malcolm. She used every tactic in the book, pulling at the threads of blood and family duty, attempting to resurrect the desperate daughter she thought she could still control. I read the email once, my face completely blank. I did not feel a single ounce of the obligation she was trying to trigger. My heart rate did not increase and my hands did not shake. I simply clicked on her contact profile, navigated to my advanced security settings, and created a permanent auto-delete filter, targeting her email address and her phone number. Any future attempts to reach me would be instantly scrubbed from my digital servers before they even had the chance to register on my screen. Closed my laptop, took a slow sip of my coffee, and went back to my corporate security reports. Exactly 1 year after the day, my family chose to ghost my wedding to celebrate in Cancun. The heavy Georgia heat was giving way to a cool, perfect autumn evening. DeAndre and I were hosting our 1 year anniversary party, right in the backyard of the very same home my family had so casually tried to trash and violate. The custom cream-colored sofa in the living room was pristine. The expensive vintage wine was flowing freely, but this time it was being poured into the glasses of people who actually belonged in our lives. The backyard patio was illuminated by soft string lights, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering. It was not a massive, stressful event. Just 30 of our closest friends, trusted colleagues, and the remarkably supportive relatives of my husband. His mother was laughing near the outdoor kitchen, holding a plate of catered food and chatting animatedly with my lead security engineer. There was no tension in the air, no walking on eggshells, no racist microaggressions to dodge, no underlying anxiety about maintaining a perfect public image. There was only genuine, authentic joy and the comfortable ease of a chosen family that uplifted one another without hidden agendas or toxic expectations. I stood near the edge of the manicured lawn, wearing an elegant emerald green dress, holding a crystal flute of champagne, and simply taking in the beautiful scene, the trauma of my past, the years of emotional neglect, the constant belittling, the theft, and the dramatic church confrontation felt like a lifetime away. They were nothing more than deleted files on a corrupted hard drive, entirely erased from my current operating system. DeAndre walked over to me, his footsteps silent on the grass. He wrapped a strong, secure arm around my waist and pressed a soft, warm kiss to my temple. He looked out at the crowd of smiling faces and then looked down at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute adoration, and asked quietly if I was happy. I looked up at my husband, the man who had stood faithfully by my side as we dismantled the toxic empire my father claimed to build. I looked at the beautiful, secure fortress of a home we had protected, and I felt a profound, absolute peace settling deep into my bones. I am exactly where I am supposed to be, I answered, leaning comfortably into his embrace. I raised my glass of champagne, turning slightly to face the camera, to face the audience listening to this journey. And I offered a knowing, satisfied smile. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, I said, my voice carrying the unshakable confidence of a woman who had finally claimed her own worth. You just have to be smart enough to lock the door behind it. The most profound lesson from Nyla's journey is that sharing DNA does not guarantee unconditional love, respect, or loyalty. True family is built on a strong foundation of mutual support, not exploitation. For years, Nyla endured emotional neglect and financial manipulation, believing she had to earn her family's basic respect. However, she ultimately realized that setting firm, unapologetic boundaries is the highest form of self-care. Walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is fundamentally an act of survival. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep your abusive family members warm. If you have ever had to set hard boundaries to protect your own peace, share your empowering story in the comments below and hit subscribe.